All right, Boker Tov again, everybody. Great to be together. This is the second week of 6 weeks of a Thursday morning, 10 a.m. summer series on modern Jewish thinkers. And the first two are with me. We did Professor Eliezer Berkovits last Thursday, and today I'm excited to introduce you to the thought and writing of Dr. Ronit Irshai. And after this week, we'll have 2 weeks with Rav Ezra on Martin Buber's writing on Zionism and Zion. And then 2 weeks with Rabbanit Bracha on the thought of the late Lord Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sacks and some of his thinking and writing on fundamental Jewish values. So it's fun to have this little change of pace and a little summer learning together. Welcome again, everybody. For those who don't usually learn with me on Thursdays, we have a wonderful group and so glad you're here joining us. And as I mentioned last week, this will be a little bit more frontal lecture / reading style than usual. Definitely, please pop a comment in the chat as we go. If you want to share a comment or unmute, just mention if you'd like to share something, and we'll certainly have opportunity to pause at a few points along the way to get feedback and reactions to what I think will not in any way be a new set of ideas and thoughts, but perhaps the formulation and the analysis and the application of them may be a little bit new and different. And I think one of the many contributions of philosophy and thought in general is to give us not just organized analysis of ideas that we often kind of think about and debate with each other, but also rubrics, terminologies, shorthands in a sense for how to engage with these ideas in shared conversation. So in particular, it's the idea of Akedah theology that I want to share from Professor Ronit Irshai and look at its applications in a couple of contexts. We'll see how we do. We're going to read a few excerpts from 2 articles, which again, I'll be happy if you reach out to me or Shuli afterwards. If you'd like me to send the PDFs of those articles, I'm happy to do so. And I hope, I'll say time permitting, but I'm going to try to structure things in such a way that for the last few minutes, we get a chance to look at one of the ways that this popped right onto the lively modern Orthodox, open Orthodox discussion scene just a couple of years ago in a very explicit and direct way. So this is not just ivory tower thought at all, but very much at the heart of contemporary discussions in our communities around Jewish thought, around Halacha. I'm not going to draw any direct links to last week's learning about Professor Berkovits. Obviously, we saw in his writing, a deep sense that the Torah's core values are, grounded in morality, and their goal and mission is to create moral people. Where exactly he would fall out on the issue we're going to really delve into today, which is can, and if so, what happens if halacha and morality conflict, is something about which he certainly has written, but I don't have the background to articulate his stance on it. But we certainly can have his thinking in the back of our minds as we do dive in. So let me start with who is Professor Ronit Irshai. She is this is a bio from the Hartman page. So of course it starts with her Hartman role, a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Yerushalayim. I think her primary job is a lecturer in the gender studies program at Bar Ilan University. She's been a teacher and scholar, guest teacher and scholar in many places. And her research focuses on religious feminism, gender and Jewish law, philosophy of halacha, bioethics, and feminist jurisprudence and its relationship to Jewish law. She's written a lot, and we'll see some comments from her second essay, actually, I think from her first essay about Professor Tamar Ross and her philosophy and theology. Her first book was on fertility and Jewish law, feminist perspectives on Orthodox responsa literature in 2012. A lot of her current writing is on gender identity and, contemporary Jewish law approaches across denominations. She's written on Reform responsa, as well as modern Orthodox halachic approaches to transgender and the like. So very engaged in issues of the day. I chose the Hartman bio because that's the context in which I met her 4 summers ago when our family was in Israel and Shira was a fellow of the David Hartman Center. She introduced me both to the writings of Dr. Ronit Irshai and to Dr. Irshai herself, and I had a couple wonderful conversations with her. At that time, I was doing a little bit of research and reading on homosexuality and halacha, about which we'll see she's also written. And so the opportunity to talk with her was really a privilege. So from there, let's go to the first of her 2 essays. Okay. This is called Religion and Morality, Akedah, Theology, and Cumulative Revelation as Contradictory Theologies in Jewish Modern Orthodox Feminism. What I primarily want to do with this essay is introduce you to her concept of Akedah theology, and then we'll touch a little bit on the heart of this essay of how she sees it relating to modern Orthodox feminism. Just going to be keeping an eye on the clock because I want to make sure we get to see essay number 2 and the hotly debated article that sort of relates to these ideas from a couple of years ago. So I want to begin with the way she introduces these ideas. And again, I think they put some language around thoughts and debates we probably have on a somewhat regular basis. So here's part 1, the relationship between religion and morality, and Akedah theology in Jewish thought. Of course, just a reminder, Akedah, as we'll see, refers to Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac, the story of the commands from God to Abraham to sacrifice his son. We'll see how that's used to develop a theological stance and who uses it and how. The nexus between religion and moral principles has engaged philosophers and theologians for many generations, right? We could certainly do an entire, year-long course on that question. The crux of the matter would seem to be the question of whether the ethical and moral are totally congruent with divine injunctions and in fact determined by the latter, or whether God does not define good and evil, but only wishes to make human beings aware that they exist and commands them to choose the good, right? A different way perhaps of formulating this question, which is the title of an essay by the late extraordinary Rabbi Dr. Aaron Lichtenstein, is the question, is there an ethic independent of halacha? Is there an ethical system that exists independent of halacha? Or no, the halacha and ethics are identified one to one. And even more broadly, for putting kind of halacha aside, we could even ask it as a broader religious question. Is everything which God commands ethical because God has commanded it? Or is it possible for God to command things that are not ethical, or said a little bit differently, is there an independent relationship between God's commands and ethics? In their broad study of the relationship between religion and morality, Sagi and Statman, these are contemporary Israeli philosophers and scholars, distinguish 2 types of dependence of morality on religion, strong and weak. Strong dependence means that the very existence of morality or its validity depends on religion. In other words, God is the source of morality and the sole basis for its validity, and morality itself cannot exist in the absence of a divine injunction. Hence, whatever God commands is ipso facto moral. In other words, this view eliminates the very possibility of a conflict between the moral and religious, right? They are one and the same because God is the source of morality. So whatever it is that God commands is definitionally moral, and you can't have any immoral divine command. That's what they call a strong dependence argument. Weak dependence, on the other hand, means that morality depends on religion only in terms of human beings' ability to recognize what is moral, or in terms of their ability to implement moral norms. To put it differently, morality is independent, but human beings, because of the limits of their mind or weakness of their desires, cannot comprehend and implement morality without religion. Again, let's understand this one. at a most basic level, there are two separate realms, morality and religion, God's command, but they wind up mapping one-to-one onto each other, but they begin as independent. It's just that human beings need God commanding these things in order to be able to develop our moral sense. But it's not the case that the things are moral only because God commanded them and that's what makes them moral. There is an independent morality there, and God is sort of teaching us that by commanding those things to us, but they're not made to be moral because they are commanded by God. Those things, as you can hear, don't necessarily have a major, we call a nafkamina, a major, practical difference between them, but at a philosophical level, they are different. Okay, we'll keep going. Religion finds the view of morality as the divine command extremely seductive because it preserves God's total freedom and absolute sovereignty. But this view exacts a heavy toll because it forgoes the idea of God's beneficence or moral nature, inasmuch as, with utter arbitrariness, God can ordain and command anything, even acts of cruelty and evil. Statman and Sagi argue that from a philosophical point of view, one should reject both views of morality as divine command. They emphasize the independence of morality from religion with regard both to its validity and to human knowledge of it. In addition, Sagi demonstrates that the idea that morality depends on divine commands, the strong dependence argument, is not widespread in Jewish tradition, where one can find at most views espousing weak dependence. Okay, so a couple of points in this paragraph. First, the point that again, here we're recognizing we don't actually know what is correct here. Philosophers will debate these different points of view, and we might find any of them compelling, more or less compelling to us. At a basic level, religions which want to emphasize God and draw people to a system which has God at its center are drawn to these dependence arguments, whether strong or weak, because they kind of, so to speak, and this sounds like a crazy thing to say, they protect God, right? They enable, if the goal of religion, this is a big if the goal of religion is to perpetuate a kind of following of God, then religions are aided by setting up a God that is, impervious to critique, because even things that will appear or feel possibly evil to us will always be defended as, if God commanded it, it must be moral. And so that's what would draw a religion to this kind of approach. But again, these philosophers argue that that's a danger, and religions should not take that approach. And also, they've argued that that's not the conventional Jewish approach. That actually, if you look through traditional Jewish sources, you'll find the idea that at best we have the weak dependence approach, and more primarily we have the sense that there is an ethic independent of halacha. So that their argument is that this approach in Jewish tradition would be a minority or newer voice. At the same time, continuing on, the dependence thesis can find a new outlet for expression in the idea that God's sovereignty is expressed not by God's determining morality, but by God's transcending morality. In other words, morality stands by itself with no dependence on religion, but in this view, religious persons must opt to follow God's directives, even if they are not moral. Statman and Sagi call this the conflict thesis. Okay, so the conflict thesis is the notion that there is fundamentally independence. Right? Morality is its own system, and God's commands are their own system. But when they come into conflict, when a divine command is seen to be, by that independent moral system, seen to be immoral, you still have to follow the divine command. Yes, they can be at odds with each other, but you still have to follow the divine command. In terms of logical consistency, the dependence thesis and the conflict thesis are contradictory, inasmuch as the former identifies divine commands with morality, and essentially eliminates any possible contradiction between them, while the latter maintains the autonomous status of morality, but emphasizes that there can be a conflict between religious and moral obligations. At the same time, both preserve the religious intuition that would enshrine God's freedom and sovereignty, right? So 2 points in this paragraph. When it comes to logic, the dependence thesis, the idea that morality is defined as morality because it is divine command, that they're one and the same, and morality is determined by divine command, right? Though that's completely at odds with the idea that there can be and there will be conflict between morality and divine command because they're two totally separate systems. They may overlap, but they're not the same system. They're different systems. In that sense, this dependence thesis and the conflict thesis contradict each other, but they ultimately work towards, or they serve a same goal, in that they both wind up sort of protecting, again, God's freedom and sovereignty. According to the dependence thesis, it's because anything is moral because God commanded it, and therefore God's freedom and sovereignty is protected. In the latter, commands could be immoral, but you have to do them anyway because God commanded them, and that enshrines God's freedom and sovereignty. When it comes to the conflict thesis, now we are coming up to her kind of novel of sorts, kind of analysis and framework. When it comes to the conflict thesis, 20th century Jewish thought developed what I call Akedah theology. This holds that obedience to a divine imperative embodied in Halacha is associated with the experience of binding up, Hebrew Akedah, all our specifically human inclinations, desires, and needs, including our moral principles. Although not all divine injunctions are necessarily at odds with morality, I editorially would say the vast majority are not. The ultimate test of believers' faith and commitment to God when they do face such a dilemma is manifested by their willingness to bind up their moral ideas and submit to the divine injunction. Now, it's worth noting that she considers this a 20th century Jewish thought. I don't know if she's written or others have argued that this idea has developed in any place before now. I remember one scholar, I think it was Ariel Schremer, who passed through the Beit for a few years, kind of talking about even the like earlier medieval Ashkenazic communities that were, from the Crusades or other moments pressed into various kinds of martyrdom, kind of turning back to the Akedah as a model. So again, martyrdom may be a different category than, using the Akedah as a model for giving up our moral principles. In fact, it really is a different one, but it's interesting to see how the Akedah has been used as a touchstone across history. I think she's, as far as I can tell, correct that using it in this way is new in Jewish thought here in the 20th century, and she's going to bring two major proponents. Rabbi Dr. Soloveitchik and Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz view the Akedah as total submission to God, as the ultimate expression of the sacrifice that is required of individuals in their religious life, and the basic disposition that a religious person must adopt. According to Soloveitchik, without submission to God, a person is not free, but is rather subject to natural arbitrariness. Shaping one's life in accordance with Halacha means overcoming natural tendencies, urges, and the law of causation. Hence, the religious life demands acts of self-sacrifice. As he puts it, this is a quote from Rav Soloveitchik, the religious act is primarily an act of suffering. When man and God happen to arrive at the same hostel, H-O-S-T-E-L, God demands of him self-sacrifice that is expressed through a struggle with his primitive instincts, through breaking his will. Offer your sacrifice. This is the most important demand made of the religious person. The Holy One, blessed be he, says to Abraham, take your son, your only one. In other words, I demand of you the greatest possible sacrifice. Now, it's interesting here, and she has in other articles many more quotes from Rav Soloveitchik, and I'm actually going to jump to a different one for a moment, in a moment. Here, it's not clear that the instincts that are being sacrificed are necessarily moral ones. It could be other, instincts of basic human desire or will or something like that. But in other places, it's clear. In fact, I'm going to illustrate with one other example now that I think is quite striking from the article that we're going to come to at the response to the article we're going to come to at the end. It's here. In 1975, Rav Soloveitchik told the following story. We cannot permit a gioret, a convert, to marry a Kohen. And sometimes the cases are very tragic, as I know from my own experience. I had a case in Rochester. A Gentile girl became a gioret, a convert, before she met the boy. She was a real gioret hatzedek. She did not join our fold because she wanted to marry somebody. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it is, we generally have two kinds of people, two contexts in which people convert to Judaism. One, they're interested in marrying a Jewish partner, and that's not in and of itself problematic as long as their commitment to Judaism remains ironclad, irrespective of what would happen to the relationship. And then others who simply their souls and spirits move them and they're drawn to Judaism without any context of particular relationship or romantic relationship. The case being described here is that latter case. Right? Then she met a Jewish boy, became, engaged, etc. I have no idea. There's a little ellipsis here. He had absolutely no knowledge of Judaism. She brought him close to Yahadut, Judaism. They got engaged and he visited the cemetery. Since he had come closer to Yahadut, he wanted to find out about his family tree. So he visited the cemetery in which his grandfather was buried, and he saw a strange symbol, 10 fingers. So they began to ask. They thought it was a mystical symbol, and then they discovered that he is a Kohen. What can you do? This is the halacha. The Kohen is forbidden to marry the gioret, the convert. We surrender to the will of the Almighty. On the other hand, to say that the halacha is not sensitive to problems, not responsive to the needs of the people, is an outright falsehood. The halacha is responsive to the needs of both the community and the individual. But the halacha has its own orbit, moves at its own certain definite speed, has its own pattern of responding to a challenge, its own criteria and principles. This is Rav Soloveitchik speaking, from a rabbinic house that is called Beis Harav, the house into which I was born. And believe me, Rav Chaim, that's his ancestor, used to try his best to be a mekil, lenient. However, there were limits even to Rav Chaim's skills. When you reach the boundary line, it is all you can say. I surrender to the will of the Almighty. This is a sadness in my heart, and I share in the suffering. That was the term we saw in Dr. Irshai's article. I share in the suffering of the poor woman who was instrumental in bringing him back to the fold, and then she had to lose him. She lost him. She walked away. Again, I can imagine all kinds of emotional responses we may be having to this, and to the extent to which some of them are, this is so cold, this is so cruel, this is so callous. I want to really encourage you to take into your heart that I believe Rav Soloveitchik in the way when he writes, we have to do everything in our power, and then we reach a boundary line and there's nothing we can do. And I have no doubt that they did the things that we do in these situations. We ask a question of whether really is he a Kohen? Is there any way to cast aspersions on the kahuna, etc.? We do whatever we can do. And if we can't do any more, says the Rav, then the halacha is the halacha. They can't get married. And we truly, we share in their suffering. We're not, this is not a happy moment. We feel the pain, but that moment, coming back to this, our essay, that moment of suffering is almost the definitional moment of what it means to be a religious person. We're not happy about it, but it is a moment of definition. All along, when we go along and there's no conflict between it's easy, it's happy to keep kosher, it's happy to keep Shabbat, etc. Those are not the moments that define us religiously. The fundamental religious act is the act of suffering or sacrifice. Yeah, take or leave. I have lots of feelings about this. But I want to introduce it here. Leibowitz, too, we're going on further. Thanks for bearing with me, knowing that you likely have many responses or reactions. Leibowitz, too, understands the relationship between the religious obligation and the cultural world beyond religion through the prism of the Akedah. Believers sacrifice their values in the name of obedience to God. Abraham is put to the test, in which fulfilling the divine command addressed to him demands that he violate human morality. He goes into detail about this as well. Actually, I want to read this quote. The religion of values and beliefs is an endowing religion, a means of satisfying man's spiritual needs and of assuaging his mental conflicts. Its end is man, and God offers his service to man. A religion of mitzvot, this is setting up a contrast here between the religion of values and beliefs and the religion of mitzvot. A religion of mitzvot is a demanding religion. It imposes obligations and tasks and makes of man an instrument for the realization of an end which transcends man. And now Professor Leibowitz offers his mapping, how this maps onto religions. A religiosity of the first type is characteristic of Christianity. Its symbol, the cross, represents the sacrifice God brought about for the benefit of mankind. In contrast, the highest symbol of the Jewish faith is the stance of Abraham on Mount Moriah, when all human values were annulled and overridden by fear and love of God. The Akedah is man's absolute mastery over his own nature. Not everyone is Abraham, and not everyone is put to so terrible a test as that of the Akedah. Nevertheless, the daily performance of the mitzvot represents the motivation animating the Akedah. Summarizing. If according to this religious outlook, human beings must subjugate their thoughts, instincts, and values to the divine command, it would seem that they must also renounce the mandates of their conscience or moral belief. If so, any new moral concept must be examined in light of religious injunctions. Should a contradiction emerge, human beings must give up their earthbound insights. There is clearly an unavoidable collision between Akedah theology, whether according to strong dependence or the conflict thesis, and any idea that, in the name of human moral insights, demands religious recognition. In the present generation, religious feminism is the most salient example of a moral criticism of patriarchal religious ideas, as it advances a stubborn demand for changes to the religious narrative and halacha in the name of modern values such as human dignity and equality. In what follows, I will examine the relationship between Akedah theology with the insights we can glean from it and emerging concepts of Jewish feminist theology. Okay, so hopefully what we had a chance to see so far is the framing of this idea of Akedah theology, that it's essentially a response primarily to the conflict thesis, the idea that there is an independent morality, which again, Professor Sagi and Statman argue is the overriding Jewish philosophical Jewish thought approach, that there is an independent morality and an independent halacha, set of divine command. They may come into conflict. And what happens when they come into conflict? Akedah theology, that's the conflict thesis on its own. The conflict thesis doesn't say what you do in those situations. Akedah theology is one answer to what you do in those situations, which is you submit even your moral inclination to divine will, and that's a kind of definitional moment of religious identity. I think actually, looking at the time, what I want to do is jump across to a different way of relating to the conflict thesis, maybe the kind of opposite end of the spectrum, and then maybe we'll come back to Professor Irshai's way of articulating this, not in the context of feminism, given the limited time we have, but in the context of homosexuality. So I want to share one more thing, and then I promise I will pause for quick questions or comments. Okay. Okay. So it's hard to decide what the right order is here. So before we get to the way Akedah theology for Dr. Irshai, her analysis of how it plays out in halachic discussions of homosexuality and contemporary modern Orthodoxy and the conservative movement, let's look at a different way of relating to the conflict thesis. This is an article by a friend and extended community member, Professor Aaron Kohler, teaches at YU, I believe in the Bible department here, Near Eastern Studies. There is a conflict at once simple and profound at play in the question of homosexuality within traditional Judaism. It's simple in that it is easy to articulate. It is profound in its import, both for our community and for our attitude towards halacha. The conflict is, in short, halacha is unforgiving in its condemnation of homosexual relationships for both men, biblically, and I would editorialize here specifically speaking about same-sex intercourse, right? The question of other aspects of love, partnership, marriage, other dimensions of physical intimacy, I think is a different halachic question. But same-sex intercourse biblically for men is condemned, and rabbinically for women is condemned, prohibited. I don't want to say condemned, I'll say prohibited. But respect for each human being's right to love whom they wish live with whom they wish, and build stable relationships built on mutual love and respect with whomever they wish, is equally unforgiving in demanding that the community not discriminate among sexualities. In even shorter form, the clashes between halacha and humanity. It's interesting that he doesn't choose to say morality here, but I think that we could, using the conflict thesis, substitute the idea of morality. Of course, where this gets messy and complicated is the idea that the values of that morality are not values that are outside of Judaism. They also exist within Judaism. And those are the times where we can use those values to shape a halachic approach, which tries to bring the two closer together. In other words, we can say the idea that the Jewish value that, of love, of family, of it's not good for a person to be alone, all those things will push us to interpret halacha in a way which is maximally supportive of same-sex relationships. And I think, in fact, in contemporary halachic approaches, maybe we'll see a little bit of this in Dr. Irshai, would move, and she quotes Rav Yaakov Meidan as one voice hinting in this direction, to say that we should limit the prohibition only to the literal biblical prohibition, and say that everything else, marriage, love relationships, raising children together, other forms of physical intimacy outside of same-sex intercourse, none of those things are necessarily prohibited. And if there are different voices about them in the tradition, we should lift up the more permissive voices. Rav Soloveitchik, in principle, might agree with that. He might, when he says that, that Rav Chaim, his forebear looked to be lenient wherever possible because of the values of human dignity. But where we might say almost universally that we bump up against a problem is the verse, the biblical pasuk prohibiting same-sex intercourse. There, we might say a fundamental value of freedom to love healthily and well bumps up against the halacha. And that may feel a moment in which the halacha feels immoral if one adopts the conflict thesis, right? If one adopts the dependence thesis, there's no immorality, because if the Torah prohibits it, then it's not immoral to prohibit it. It is moral to prohibit it. If we don't adopt the dependence thesis and we adopt the conflict thesis, we have a moment of conflict. What do we do in that moment of conflict? Okay, let's go further. Some will say that this is indeed tragic, but that submission to the yoke of halachic authority is the sine qua non of our community. Some have even invoked the religious model of Akedah Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, to explain that one must subjugate one's own will and desires to fealty to God. I seriously doubt that this is the meaning of that story. And in any event, remember the end. Abraham is told not to harm his son, and perhaps God thereby teaches him and us that religious devotion may not come through the harm of others. So the first thing that Professor Kohler does is says to us, if we're using the Akedah as our model, but what is the actual lesson of the Akedah? Maybe on the one hand, it seems to be a willingness to suspend or put aside our independent sense of morality for divine command. On the other hand, at the end of the story, we're not asked, Abraham is not ultimately asked to do that. So he even casts a question, is there even such a model? Is that the correct understanding of the Akedah model? Okay, so he poses that question. But then he goes on to say, this is the most disturbing part of the Akedah theology, as Ronit Irshai calls it, or he invokes her because she's really the proponent and kind of developer of identifying this stream in 20th century, say, modern Orthodox Jewish thought, right? She's not the proponent in the sense of the advocate for it, but she's the one who sort of collected and helped us see with Rav Soloveitchik and Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz's paradigms, and then she tracks it through more contemporary thinkers, including in interesting ways in a Hebrew article, Professor Rav Yuval Shurlo, who for me is one of the real shining lights of contemporary Dati Leumi, modern Orthodox thought and halacha. So it's interesting how she sees it playing out in his thought. But so again, she's not the advocate, but she's the real organizer and one who brings to light the way in which it is impacting our theology and lived lives to today. We are all in certain ways students of Rav Soloveitchik and his students and others. So this is the most disturbing part of the Akedah theology. It invariably is framed as self-sacrifice, but actually involves the sacrifice of another. I may be called to put aside my liberal values, but the person who actually pays the price is the LGBT friend who is not allowed to get married, not wished a mazal tov in the weekly community announcements. I don't know if that's an explicit reference to our own challenge and history with that here in the Bayit, not welcomed with their partner into myriad communal frameworks. Hey, so that I think that it's a really interesting point. We don't even need to focus there because it is also the case that Akedah theology involves the sacrifice of the self, right? Part of the idea is that the Akedah theology, very powerfully impacts members of our LGBT Orthodox community who want to choose to continue to identify and be Orthodox. Akedah theology asks them to make that sacrifice. So I think this is an interesting point, but it's not necessarily the central point. Fortunately, there is a different way to go about this. What's the way to go about this? So he develops a really interesting line of thought. The rabbis of the Talmud offer an entirely different model for encounters between our most deeply held values and law. On the contrary, Jewish law ought to be consonant with our values, assuming we really believe them to be true. Going a little further, he quotes a number of sources. It's inconceivable, here talking about the wayward and rebellious son who is killed for gluttony. It's inconceivable that the Torah would mean that, as it is grossly unethical. When it is suggested that a verse in Vayikra means that menstruating women should not look attractive, this is rejected, since this would cause a rift in the marriage, and that can't be what the Torah wanted. Even when the rabbis were convinced that a course of action would be the correct one, if it were unsustainable because of sociological realities, it was abandoned. After all, the Torah was not given to the angels, a passage in the Gemara in a couple of places, but to human beings. So he here develops the idea that halacha has, as we've sort of touched on, internal values, mechanisms, and processes to try to bring it in line with morality. Again, this is still not the dependence thesis. It sort of starts with the conflict thesis, that there can be theoretical conflicts, but then ultimately, somehow we are tasked with bringing them back into alignment. Now, is that because ultimately they are definitionally aligned? Then we're sort of back to the dependence thesis. It doesn't seem like it. It seems like it's still an assertion of maybe something more like the weak dependence, or an attempt to kind of a secondary conflict thesis, that there could be moments of conflict, and then our job is to work within the halachic system to resolve those conflicts. We are not, of course, Talmudic rabbis, neither with the intellectual and religious bona fides that they had, nor the legal authority to do what they did. But their model of authenticity speaks across that great divide. And now here comes, I think, the really radical moment. In the absence of the authority to change the law, I have no choice but to choose against it. The Jewish philosopher Avi Sagi said, later generations will find the solution to this. People live with contradictions and don't always settle them. But to say I cannot live morally because of my loyalty to a system that forbids me to do so is unacceptable. If a religious person tells me that, my answer is that God too is bound by morality. And when you deny God's morality, you turn God into a demon. So in short, in a clash between humanity and halacha, opt for humanity and have enough faith in halacha that the problem will be solved. And if somehow the conflict remains intractable, I would rather suffer for being a good person than sacrifice someone else's life on the altar of my religiosity. So now we have a really interesting different approach, which is in essence, fundamentally maintains the conflict thesis. It then states that the conflicts that Jewish tradition, as carried out by human beings, interpreted and developed by human beings, has the tools to resolve those conflicts, but that it often takes time and sometimes our hands are tied for one reason or another. And that during the period of those gaps, when the conflicts exist, again, because of a fundamental belief in the independence thesis, that there is a morality independent of halacha, and that sometimes they come into contradiction, it's both our job to work towards their resolution, to have faith that they will be resolved, and also to follow the morality against the halacha. This, as you can imagine, was roundly criticized and vociferously attacked by others in the Orthodox community, and certainly not resolved in any way, shape, or form. And I feel conflicted about it, deeply conflicted about it, of course. I have this sort of opposite uneasinesses about it as I have about the Akedah theology. But I present it to you as a counterpoint by someone who I believe absolutely identifies as Orthodox, really takes these issues seriously, and sort of presents an interesting approach. It's not, I should also want to articulate, it's not sort of the antithesis of Akedah theology. It's not a rejection of halacha. It's a belief that halacha has the tools and can and hopefully will arrive at a resolution to the conflict, but also a statement that in that intervening period, I, says the author, have to choose the morality over the halacha. And I also want to raise, I think we can intuitively understand the risks in both of these sort of close to opposite approaches to the conflict thesis that we've seen. The risks in Akedah theology, are similar to what Professor Irshai raised as the risks in the dependence thesis. It protects God and limits our sense of developing a moral voice, and that poses challenges for the continued development of halacha to its most moral place, right? Even if we take Rav Soloveitchik's articulation that that Rav Chaim was always looking to be maximally lenient, if in the end of the day we lift up as a religious value the suffering in the place where halacha and morality conflicts, I think it reduces our motivation to try to resolve those conflicts, because we say, this is a heroic moment. It's a deeply painful moment, but it's also a heroic moment. Now we know we're truly loyal to God's commands because we are following it in a moment of conflict with our morals. That is powerful and deepens a religious identity in one sense. On the other sense, it is likely to weaken our drive to find halachic solutions. So I think that's the sort of how I see the risk with Akedah theology. The risk, I think, with the Professor Kohler's resolution is kind of course, the opposite. In choosing the moral moment as opposed to halacha, even while articulating a belief that halacha will find the resolution, it also, in a sense, it's actually the same problem. It also weakens our drive to come to the halachic solutions, but whereas I think it also weakens our commitment to halacha. Maybe they each have that problem. So I want to sort of put that counterpoint. I think actually my most basic goals for this class are sort of met already by presenting Akedah theology, and I think its counterpoint, the conflicts and the pros and cons. I want to still delve into Professor Irshai's analysis of how modern Orthodoxy and the conservative movement differ in their approach to homosexuality and halacha as its sort of test case of Akedah theology. But I also want to pause here and open up for questions or comments. So what I'm going to do is what we usually do on Thursday mornings: raise a hand or say your name if you want to comment, and I'll try to collect up a number of speakers, react quickly, and hopefully we'll have a couple more minutes before we conclude. So I see Myrna. I see Bevan. Great. I see Leza. Great. Okay. We'll suffice with that group, and then I hope to point out a couple of other things before we conclude. So go ahead, Myrna, you're up.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, two questions. One is a quick one. Rabbi Kohler, is he still part of the Yeshiva University faculty after this explosive new idea? That's the quick one. And the second one is, how do you handle the aguna? How do you handle the aguna? You wait? How long can you wait? Two questions.
Excellent. I'm quickly checking. As far as I know, yes, absolutely. Professor Kohler is still a member in good standing of the Near Eastern Studies Department of Yeshiva University, and a wonderful Bible teacher there. I think it's probably worth noting that his writing, his focus areas, which are biblical interpretation, Semitic language, Jewish intellectual history, while obviously connected, to the hashkafa, the worldview and philosophy that he puts out here, it's not precisely his kind of area of instruction. So I imagine, I think for all kinds of reasons, even if Yeshiva University would have wanted to let him go on the basis of this, they would not have been able to do so. I don't know sort of what kind of how it impacted his kind of work and communal place there. I think the world of him as a human being and a scholar. Again, he's an extended member of our Baha'i community, but I think, of course, it's a fascinating question. What happens, when someone within? Of course, we're talking about YU. It is the institution of Rav Soloveitchik in so many ways. So interesting to see that strong counterpoint coming from a professor there. The Agunah question, Myrna, is an excellent one. I think it's precisely an example. It's another excellent example of what, a test case where we can apply the different theses to. We could apply the dependence thesis and say, it appears to us, to our, frail human sense, to be a moral problem, but God cannot instruct anything that is immoral, and therefore we have to shift our understanding. Or we can adopt the conflict thesis and say there is some way in which the halacha, because of its producing, because of the reality of agunot, is a problem with the halachic system. It's an immorality in the halachic system. And then we either choose to submit, choose to go against, and also at the same time, of course, I think for both approaches, choose to continue to work to apply the inner halachic values to a resolution. I think an interesting way one can maintain the dependence thesis in the Agunah question is essentially to say inherently, and I'd be curious for people's thoughts about this at another time, inherently, there is not an immorality. It's the evil men who are holding their wives hostage. Yes, the system in theory, yes, the system does allow for it, but that's not a fundamental problem in the system. It's a problem of the immorality of the actors and not the immorality of the system. Right? That we have that idea. Halacha can be abused in many ways. Is that fundamentally the problem of halacha, or is that the problem of the actors? So I think it's a really interesting and important question, which can't resolve here. But I think always when we see a potential challenge to the system, we want to sort of play it out according to the different theses as you suggested here. So thank you.
One quick follow-up, and
a quick follow-up.
Would any modern Orthodox rabbi marry such a person who's still an aguna?
Right, great question. In essence, I sort of feel like in part what you're asking is, what will be the application of the Professor Aaron Kohler principle? Would someone say, because if I believe that this is an immoral stance of the halacha, and I choose the humanity over the halacha, how would that play out? Right, so it might play out in some way of saying, I believe you must necessarily be divorced because the halacha cannot hold you hostage, and therefore you are divorced, and therefore I would marry you. I don't know of any Orthodox rabbis who would do that. It is an opportunity to mention the outstanding work of the International Beit Din, which was established by Rabbi Simcha Kraus, Zecher Tzadik Libracha, with Blue Greenberg's advocacy and continued leadership, which Rabbi Yehuda Warburg,
Rabbi Rackman,
Stigman, right, and others are developing and moving forward, which is looking to use existing halachic solutions to resolve aguna issues. And I think, that again gets back to that using everything within the boundaries of halacha. And for someone who would, that's a moment where I could see these things coming into conflict, where someone could say, oh, that's too much of a minority voice, the voices that allow, let's say, nullifying a marriage based on the fact that it was done under false pretenses, which only at a later point came to light, but could be established to have been always originally there. The husband had mental health issues that were always present, but never came to the surface, and now we see that they were always there, and therefore there was a misleading pretense unto which the marriage was entered into, and we can therefore nullify the marriage, and no divorce, no legal divorce, no get is needed. That's an approach which the International Beit Din utilizes, wherever it's possible. If someone were to say, well, that's a minority voice in the halacha, and therefore we can't rely on that position, and we simply just have to suffer because that's our religious stance, that would sort of like be an Akedah theology approach, I think, where it would not necessarily even be warranted. It is also the case, I would say, that the International Beit Din still functions under the conflict thesis because they have cases that they have not been able to resolve. In other words, they don't have the approach that it always has to be able to work right now. I don't think they would take the Akedah theology sort of approach of saying, and this is our ultimate religious value in a sense, but I do think that they would say that the religious stance mandates that we continue to submit to the halacha as we understand it, even as we try to find solutions. Okay, we're going to come to Bev and Ted. Thank you, Lerna. Great question, great example. Bev and Ted, go ahead. See if you can unmute. Are you able to unmute?
I'm going under the assumption that God is good. And by that, I mean, I'd like to give two situations. One about the young lady who was a convert.
Yes.
Maybe her role in life was to bring this particular man back to Judaism, and her reward will be in stepping out of the situation that contradicts halacha. Her reward is that she will meet an even better match whenever that happens. So it kind of changes the picture of her being a loser. The other point I want to make is that I don't necessarily agree with the halachic point of view that God was testing Abraham. I remember as the chair of the department of social studies at George Washington High School, a student turned in a regent's paper that, except for one question, received extremely high marks. And whoever marked that question, this other question, gave it an extremely low mark, saying that the student didn't answer the question, and as proof, gave the Regents Committee answer to that question. I saw it differently. I saw the student as having interpreted the question in a somewhat novel, or if you want to call it out of the box way, which made his or hers, I don't remember, response perfectly legitimate and well expressed. So it could have made the difference between the student failing the Regents and passing it with a reasonably good grade. And so I now get to my point that I don't believe that God was testing Abraham. I think Abraham had long since proven his obedience and respect for God's wishes, and that Abraham was a collaborator, not in being tested, but in testing Isaac, who was supposed to be the next leader of the Jewish people. And in the story, we know that Isaac was not a child, he was a mature man. And the test he passed was that if God and Abraham asked him to do something, he would not defy. He would silently accept his fate. And so Abraham never doubted that God would spare Isaac, particularly because Isaac would be the only possible future of the future patriarch of the Jewish people. So tell me I'm an Apicorus. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for both points, and I appreciate. First, I think, and we need Shira for this kind of thing. In the conflict thesis, where we say that that morality and halacha are independent, and there can be a conflict between them, does that necessarily lead to a definition of God as not fundamentally benevolent? Meaning, if there is a conflict between them, does that make God, in the cases where there is conflict between halacha and morality, immoral? That seems to me to be the implication, which is very, very difficult to swallow. The one resolution to it, which is in the first article that we only saw the framework of and didn't get to see the Jewish feminism piece, is how Professor Irshai analyzes Dr. Tamar Ross's approach to divine revelation, we call cumulative revelation, which is a sense that kind of the divine word is always being interpreted, of course, and developed by human beings. And therefore, sometimes there can, if there is an immorality, it may be a flaw in human understanding and not the divine. But I do think we have to face, if we accept absolute divinity of the mitzvot and have the conflict thesis, then it does, even though the emphasis of her point about Akedah theology is submission to divine will, it does seem like a corollary to it is a recognition that God is not perfectly good, which is, again, very, very challenging, and yet seems to be behind Akedah theology. It's just not, it's not fully developed or expressed, and it's a question I had as well. And so we have to continue to sit with it. And I appreciate absolutely what you said, Ted, and I think it was very consonant with Professor Kohler's sort of take on rethinking what the Akedah really is teaching us, and he has more writing on that elsewhere. Leza, on to you, and then I'll offer a few more words. Those who need to jump off, please feel free. I'm going to try to still wrap up at 11:10. So Leza, go ahead.
Something about, I have no answer. Maybe there is ultimately no answer. Something about the Akedah that has always bothered me. No. That is that God speaks to Abraham and Isaac hears it.
Can you speak louder?
Yeah, please do speak up as much as you can, ladies.
All right. I'll try and go louder. God actually speaks to Abraham, and Isaac hears. And they are not alone in their faith. If we come to the modern times, he doesn't speak to us, literally. It is a different experience. We are fundamentally alone. And whether that leads to, so my question is, what is God trying to teach us? I don't have no answer yet, but I think it's an important distinction that they were not alone and I am.
Yeah, very powerfully said. Thank you. Okay, I want to try to spend 5 minutes, if I can, on how Professor Irshai articulates, I think this is just a point of real fascination to me, and it relates to the Professor Kohler, Rav Soloveitchik debate, so to speak, which is how she sees this playing out in responsa literature in contemporary last 20, 30 years, let's say, about homosexuality and halacha. And I think what I want to do is sort of speak it out outside of the article, and then we'll read her conclusion. So she analyzes a number of writings and responsa from the most liberal streams of orthodoxy around homosexuality and halacha. Here's one example that she gives, which is here exemplified here. In recent years, the tension between the halachic prohibition and moral intuition has become particularly fierce, as the trend to recognize the authenticity of homosexual feelings has increased among the modern Orthodox, along with sympathy for their pain, and especially acceptance that the orientation is irreversible. The Akedah rhetoric has become correspondingly more intense. This is exemplified by a halachic opinion by the Beit Hillel rabbis, considered to be the most liberal organization of modern Orthodoxy in Israel, published in 2016. The ban on sexual relations between partners of the same sex is from the Torah. The Torah is eternal and will not be replaced. So there is no way to permit relations between same-sex partners. Those with a homosexual orientation who guard themselves against the prohibited act are valiant heroes who do the word of God, right? As she says here, such strong rhetoric is generally an indication that in today's world, it's difficult to maintain the eternal validity of the ban on male homosexuality. Here, the Akedah theology rhetoric is clear, even if the issue is not presented as a problem that pits contemporary moral concepts against halacha. The unequivocal statement that the Torah is eternal and will not be replaced implicitly posits that even in this difficult moral dilemma, the values of the Torah must not be overridden by those of the prevalent morality, right? So even though she's saying, even though in these sentences, we don't hear them say explicitly the conflict thesis, that this is immoral and yet we must follow the word of God, that certainly seems to be hinted at by calling these people valiant heroes. Seems like they're not just, restraining their will, but doing something which, goes against in some way our moral instincts. That's one example that she gives. And she develops from other examples, the idea that basically in modern Orthodoxy and liberal Orthodoxy, the approach is the Akedah theology. We actually recognize the moral problematic and yet say that we must follow the divine command. Yes, also, as she points out, the attempt to reduce the tension to a minimum. Even though there's no explicit leniency with regard to the prohibitions, there is an insistent demand that communities accept them and thereby reduce homosexual social distress to some extent, right? So she points out across the responsa literature that there is not just Akedah theology, but of course also the move for halacha to be as flexible as it can and communal norms to be as welcoming as they can. Then she comes to conservative movement rulings, and she really notes two very different approaches, which she actually sees as winding up in the same place when it comes to Akedah theology. The first is the Rabbis Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner halachic analysis, which basically says that everything is sort of an approach I articulated earlier, that while the pasuk that prohibits same-sex intercourse remains in place, all the other prohibitions, which they consider to be rabbinic prohibitions, on other forms of physical intimacy, being alone together, committed married life, etc., etc. Those things, although rabbinically prohibited, that rabbinic prohibition is overridden for the sake of kavod habriot, the dignity of human beings. Now, there are other potential halachic approaches here. That's the approach that they take. It's interesting to note, here's a link to last week, that in their analysis of kind of values which allow us to change the halacha, one of the values they quote is one of the ones that we read from Professor Berkovitz, Rabbi Dr. Berkovitz last week, the heicha de efshar, heicha de lo efshar, lo efshar. The halacha sort of has to operate in the realm of the possible and feasible. And where something is not possible or feasible, it's not possible or feasible. And in some sense, the halacha sort of can't be that. So essentially, the argument is that it is possible, right? Here we go. Relaxing these rabbinic prohibitions make it possible for homosexuals to have a couple relationship, including physical love, with the possibility of sexual relief, even without full intercourse. This preserves the dignity of homosexuals who can enter long-term significant relationship and be accepted as equal members in congregations and ordained as rabbis, as long as they accept these principles and the boundaries set by halacha. And what she then does is develops further that if you look at other places where Rabbis Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner, in particular Rabbi Dorf, writes about their approach to halacha, they reject Akedah theology, and they essentially have like some form of a dependence thesis, an understanding that God cannot command something which is immoral, and therefore we have to understand that this conclusion is actually moral, as it says here. It is not a trial for gay men to refrain from anal intercourse, and considering the other interpretive leniencies, it does not infringe their human dignity and hence is not immoral. We could disagree with that, but that's their actual stance. Then she analyzes a much stricter halachic responsum, which is of Rabbi Joel Roth from an earlier time, although he kind of reestablishes his stance in response to the Rabbis Dorf, Nevins, and Reisner tshuva. And he ultimately has the same problem. He prohibits essentially all expressions of physical intimacy between same-sex couples, but he ultimately concludes that that is actually not immoral, right? He says, we may understand that when one cannot fulfill the mandate that the law imposes, but that does not lead us to the conclusion that that mandate was itself immoral. We asked whether a moral God could prohibit homosexual behavior even in the hardest of cases. We have answered that God could and did. We can agree or disagree, but ultimately what's important to Rabbi Roth is to make the argument that the full prohibition on all forms of homosexual sexual expression is not immoral. It does not create a conflict between divine will or injunction or command and morality. Again, we might very well disagree with that, but his move to do that is essentially what leads her to say here, to return to the modern Orthodox rabbis, their fundamental difference with Roth, and as it seems with conservative rabbis in general, is their explicit adherence to Akedah theology. That is the statement that if there's a conflict between halacha and morality, the dictates of the former must be followed. As noted, even less liberal rabbis like Roth are not willing to accept the postulate that there may be a conflict between halacha and morality, and do not think that with regard to halacha, overcoming a homosexual inclination is immoral. That may be a really surprising and shocking position from a conservative rabbi or maybe any rabbi. But I think it's really, really interesting what she's creating for us, which is this idea that a kind of dividing line between modern Orthodoxy and conservative movement is not necessarily even on exactly where they land on the halachic conclusions, but on the underlying philosophy, which is that sort of strikingly, modern Orthodox approach is invested in Akedah theology, in the idea that there will be tensions between halacha and morality, and we are mandated to continue to follow the halacha. And the conservative movement, which may have a range of halachic positions, but rejects the idea that there could be a tension between morality and halacha, leading to maybe the most surprising conclusion to me, which is Rabbi Roth's conclusion that to prohibit all forms of homosexual, romantic, physical expression is not immoral. That's really surprising to me personally, but consistent with the idea of rejecting Akedah theology. Okay, and I guess the last place I want to land is to sort of say, I try to find myself in that sort of middle space of the work to do is the work to try to bring Jewish values to bear on a halachic approach, which brings as much resolution to the potential tension between halacha and morality as possible. But ultimately, I think, as I think about my own, if I could summarize in a sentence, a continual work in progress, my own theology, I think I do believe that halacha and morality, as it appears to us, are sometimes in tension. And in those moments, I think what I would say is I myself incline towards following the halacha as I understand it, but I'm not sure I feel that I could expect anyone else to do so. I think that's probably the kind of line I would walk, which is not an easy line to walk and not necessarily one that's effective at maintaining kind of stable halachic community. But I think that's sort of where I land. I think it's hard for me to reject the conflict thesis as I see it. But I certainly struggle with Akedah theology, even though in the broad view, ultimately, I don't think I free myself from it, but I'm not sure I see it as our ultimate religious expression. I guess that's where I differ from Akedah theology as she presents it. For me, it's sort of more a disappointment and a mandate that we have to be working harder in halacha than it is a moment of, even if being with the suffering, I don't see it as a moment of ultimate religious fulfillment, but maybe a moment of religious frustration, even while attempting to follow the halacha as I understand it. I would love to open up for more conversation, but we're gonna wrap up here. I went way over even the extra time I asked you for, so thanks for sticking with it. Again, I'm going to share the two articles as well as the Professor Aaron Kohler article, which is not an academic article, but a kind of a more popular article, which has links to some of his other writings, and you can see some of the other responses to it. And of course, I think this is a fundamental ongoing question and challenge about the intersection or the relationship between halacha and morality. Hopefully what we got out of this learning was a little bit of kind of language and examples to place around it when we are engaging with these questions, some of the unresolved questions, the pros and cons of the different points of view, and some of the test cases where they play out, and some interesting insight into movements, modern Orthodox and conservative. Again, I think Professor Irshai's analysis is incomplete and imperfect, but really fascinating and thought-provoking on how she sees the differentiation between Akedah theology and modern Orthodoxy, and a rejection of it in the conservative movement, even if the halachic conclusions could be almost identical in different places. So thank you so much to everybody. And I really encourage you to continue on the subsequent 4 weeks. We'll be sending reminder emails to our usual Thursday group about the upcoming sessions, and they'll be in the following by emails. Take good care, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Great to learn.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Bye.